The ground shakes violently beneath you, the air thick with ash and the unmistakable scent of sulfur. In the distance, a mountain roars to life, spewing fire and molten rock into the sky, a force so powerful it can erase entire cities in an instant. This isn't just a scene from a disaster movie. It's a reality our ancestors faced, one so terrifying they wove it into the very fabric of their myths. From the wrathful gods of Olympus to the fiery goddess Pele of Hawaiian legend, volcanoes have long been symbols of divine punishment, tools of vengeance wielded by deities to humble proud civilizations. But what if these stories are more than just ancient entertainment? What if they're coded warnings passed down through generations about the fragile balance between humanity and the forces that can destroy us? Think about Pompeii, a thriving Roman city frozen in time by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, or the legend of Atlantis, a once great empire said to have been swallowed by the sea in a single day. These aren't just tales of tragedy, they're mirrors reflecting our own vulnerabilities. The ancients understood something profound, that civilization, no matter how advanced, is always one step away from collapse. They saw volcanoes as living, breathing manifestations of the gods' anger, a reminder that human arrogance could summon catastrophe. And yet, here we are, centuries later, still building our cities on fault lines, still ignoring the whispers of the past. So why do these myths endure? Because they speak to something universal, the fear of losing everything, the awe of nature's power, and the haunting question of whether we're doomed to repeat history. Today, we're going to unravel these ancient stories, peeling back the layers to reveal the startling truths they hold. We'll journey from the smoldering ruins of Pompeii to the fiery heart of Hawaiian legends, exploring how these tales of vengeance and destruction echo in our modern world. By the time we're done, you'll see these myths not as relics of a bygone era, but as urgent lessons, ones that might just help us navigate the challenges of our own uncertain future. The ground is trembling beneath our feet. Are we listening? The fiery breath of volcanoes didn't just shape landscapes, it shaped entire worldviews. Take Pele, the Hawaiian goddess whose tears form the island's black sand beaches, while her rage carves new craters into the earth. To her people, she wasn't just a force of destruction, she was a capricious creator, a reminder that life springs from chaos. This duality echoes across cultures. In Roman myths, Vulcan's underground forge wasn't merely a source of terror, it was a sacred workshop where weapons for the gods were crafted. Every tremor was the strike of his hammer, every eruption a burst of celestial craftsmanship. These stories reveal a profound truth. Ancient societies didn't just fear volcanoes, they revered them as living bridges between the mortal and the divine. But why personify nature's fury as gods? Imagine standing before an erupting mountain, its molten rivers swallowing forests, its ash blotting out the sun. Without modern science, how else could our ancestors explain such raw power? Myths became their textbooks, their way of decoding the incomprehensible. By attributing eruptions to divine moods, Pele's jealousy, Vulcan's industrious labor, they transformed random catastrophe into something with meaning, even morality. A volcanic eruption wasn't just bad luck, it was a lesson, a punishment, or a test. This narrative gave people agency in the face of helplessness. If you angered the gods, fire would rain down. If you honored them, perhaps the earth would stay quiet. Today, we understand the tectonic plates and magma chambers behind these phenomena, yet the old stories still resonate. Science explains how volcanoes work, but mythology explains how they feel. the awe, the dread, the humbling reminder of our smallness. Modern disaster preparedness pamphlets might list evacuation routes, but ancient myths carried the same urgent message: respect the power beneath your feet. The next time you see footage of lava consuming a highway or hear warnings of an impending eruption, remember these aren't just geological events. They're the latest chapters in humanity's oldest conversation about survival, reverence, and our fragile dance with the forces that built our world. From the thunderbolts of Zeus to the fire and brimstone that rained on Sodom and Gomorrah, the idea of divine vengeance is etched into the bedrock of human storytelling. It's not just about punishment, it's about consequence. When Prometheus defied the gods to give humanity fire, Zeus didn't just chain him to a rock, he unleashed Pandora's box, flooding the world with suffering. The message was clear: defiance of the natural order comes at a cost. The Aztecs feared Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror god, who could topple kingdoms with a breath, sending plagues and earthquakes to humble the proud. And in the frozen north, Loki's lies didn't just anger the gods. They unraveled the cosmos itself, triggering Ragnarok, the end of all things. These myths share a chilling pattern: collapse isn't random. It's the price of excess, the bill coming due after centuries of exploitation. But here's what's fascinating: these stories aren't just about fear, they're about accountability. The ancients didn't see disasters as arbitrary acts of cruelty, they saw them as corrections. When the ground split open or the skies turned to fire, it wasn't just bad luck, it was a response. A society that hoarded wealth, ignored the vulnerable, or ravaged the land was inviting disaster. Sound familiar? Today, we don't call it divine wrath, we call it climate change, deforestation, or ecosystem collapse. The language has changed, but the warning remains the same. When Polynesian legends speak of Pele consuming villages that disrespect her sacred land, or when Native American stories describe rivers drying up after overhunting, they're not just spinning tales, they're encoding survival strategies. What if these myths are more than folklore? What if they're the earliest environmental impact studies? Take the Norse vision of Ragnarok, the seas rising, the sun blackened, the world consumed by flames. It's not so different from modern projections of rising global temperatures or dying oceans. The gods might be metaphors, but the lessons are literal. The Aztecs offered sacrifices to appease Tezcatlipoca, not because they were superstitious, but because they understood that balance required reciprocity. You couldn't take from the earth without giving back. Today we drill, we burn, we clear cut, and then act surprised when the storms grow fiercer, the fires wilder. The ancients would nod knowingly. They'd heard this story before. So why does this theme echo across continents and millennia? Because it's rooted in a universal truth: civilizations don't collapse from the outside in. They rot from the inside out. The gods' vengeance isn't about caprice, it's about cause and effect. When the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh describes the gods flooding the world to cleanse human corruption, or when Hindu texts warn of Kali Yuga, an age of greed ending in catastrophe, they're not predicting doom. They're offering a choice, the same choice we face now: change or pay the price. The volcanoes might sleep, the earth might seem steady, but the old myths whisper a question we can't afford to ignore. How long until the mirror cracks? Pompeii wasn't just buried, it was preserved, a city frozen in the moment of its reckoning. Walk its streets today, and you'll see bread left in ovens, frescoes still bright on crumbling walls, even the hollow spaces where bodies once lay, now filled with plaster to capture their final postures of terror or embrace. This wasn't merely an eruption, it was a mythological event made real. To the Romans, Vesuvius wasn't just a mountain, it was the fist of an angry god. They'd built their villas and bathhouses in its shadow, confident in their empire's invincibility. But when the sky rained fire, their wealth and power meant nothing. The ash didn't discriminate between slave and senator. Pliny the Younger's letters paint a scene ripped from legend. Ships trapped in a sea of pumice, people tying pillows to their heads against falling stones, a darkness so thick it felt like the underworld had swallowed the sun. His uncle, Pliny the Elder, sailed toward the chaos not to flee but to witness. He died choking on sulphurous air, a scholar turned casualty of nature's fury. What's chilling is how ordinary it all began. That morning, Pompeii's markets were open, its brothels busy, its taverns full. No one recognized the tremors as anything but minor quirks of the earth. Sound familiar? Today, we build skyscrapers on fault lines, drill into unstable seabeds, and dismiss rising temperatures as anomalies. The hubris hasn't changed, only the scale. But here's the twist. Pompeii's destruction gave us a gift. Its ruins are a time capsule, showing not just how people died, but how they lived. The graffiti on its walls isn't prophecies of doom, it's jokes, shopping lists, love notes. A bakery advertises fresh bread. A brothel's menu is carved plainly into stone. These weren't people obsessed with impending catastrophe. They were simply human, preoccupied with the daily grind. And that's the real lesson. Collapse rarely comes with a fanfare. It arrives on an ordinary day when everyone's too busy to look up. Modern seismologists can predict eruptions with startling accuracy. Yet we still cluster cities around volcanoes like moths to a flame. Bali's Agong, Japan's Fuji, even Vesuvius itself, millions live in their shadows, betting against history. Why? Because disaster is abstract until it isn't. The Romans had myths to warn them. We have data, but both boil down to the same question. How loud does the earth have to scream before we listen? Pompeii's ghosts might answer, louder than you think. Plato's Atlantis isn't just a lost city, it's a mirror. A sprawling, glittering empire with canals of gold and towers that scrape the sky, only to vanish beneath the waves in a single night of divine wrath. But here's what's haunting. The philosopher didn't write it as history. He framed it as a cautionary tale, a parable whispered across millennia about the price of hubris. The Atlanteans didn't fall because their technology failed. They fell because they forgot their place, trading virtue for conquest, balance for excess. Poseidon's fury wasn't random. It was the inevitable tide turning against those who thought themselves untouchable. Now consider the Minoans, a thriving Bronze Age civilization on Crete, their palaces adorned with frescoes of dolphins and saffron gatherers, their ships trading across the Mediterranean. Then around 1600 BC, the island of Thera exploded in one of history's most violent volcanic eruptions. Tsunamis swallowed coastal cities, ash blotted out the sun for years, and the Minoan world crumbled. Coincidence, or could this be the real-life catastrophe that inspired Plato's allegory centuries later? The parallels are uncanny. An advanced society, a sudden cataclysm from the sea, a reminder that nature writes the final rules. But Atlantis isn't just about the past. Look at modern Venice, its marble palaces sinking centimeter by centimeter as the Adriatic rises. Or Jakarta, the fastest sinking city on Earth, where skyscrapers stand ankle-deep in floodwater. We're not drowning in myth now, we're drowning in data. Satellite maps show coastlines receding, ice caps melting, storms intensifying. Yet like the Atlanteans, we keep building higher, drilling deeper, convinced our ingenuity will outpace the consequences. Plato's warning wasn't about a city, it was about a cycle. What makes the Atlantis story endure isn't its spectacle, it's its psychology. The idea that collapse isn't an accident but a reckoning. Indigenous cultures from the Andes to the Arctic have versions of this narrative. societies that took too much only to be reclaimed by the earth. The Hopi speak of a fourth world destroyed by fire after humanity grew corrupt. The Maya recorded cycles of creation and destruction tied to human folly. These aren't prophecies of doom, they're blueprints for survival. The Atlanteans had crystal-powered energy and flying machines, according to some interpretations. But without wisdom, their brilliance became their pyre. So here's the uncomfortable question. If Atlantis was fiction, why does it feel so urgent? Maybe because the deepest myths aren't about what happened. They're about what keeps happening. We're still chasing the same illusions of control, still ignoring the same warnings. The seas aren't rising because Poseidon is angry. They're rising because we've spent 2 centuries burning the past like Atlantean coal. The difference is, we don't need an oracle to see what's coming. The science is clear. The choice, now as then, is humility or hubris. The only mystery left is which one we'll choose before the water reaches our necks. The Norse didn't just predict the end, they rehearsed it. Ragnarok wasn't some distant nightmare to dread. It was a script they knew by heart, a drama where every player had their role. The wolf Fenrir breaking his chains, the serpent Jörmungandr rising from the sea, the fire giants marching across Bifrost, these weren't random disasters. They were acts in a cosmic play, each one signaling the inevitable unraveling of the old world to make way for the new. What's startling isn't the destruction itself, but the Norse attitude toward it. While other cultures saw apocalypse as punishment, the Vikings saw it as pruning, a forest fire that clears the undergrowth so sunlight can reach the soil. Consider the volcanic eruptions that rocked Iceland during the Viking Age. Whole settlements vanished under lava flows, skies turned black for years, and yet the survivors rebuilt. Not in the same places, not in the same ways, but with a stubborn adaptability that feels ripped from the sagas. When the earth shook or the glaciers melted, they didn't waste time blaming the gods. They loaded their longboats and sailed toward the next possibility. This wasn't resignation, it was a kind of radical acceptance. The prose Edda even describes 2 humans hiding in Yggdrasil's roots during Ragnarok, destined to repopulate the earth. The message, collapse isn't the finale, it's intermission. Modern resilience theorists call this adaptive cycling, the idea that systems, whether ecosystems or civilizations, need periodic disruption to avoid stagnation. Like a volcano's ash fertilizing new growth, breakdowns create space for innovation. The Norse grasped this intuitively. Their myths didn't dwell on preventing Ragnarok, they focused on surviving it. Odin gathering warriors in Valhalla wasn't just preparing for battle, he was stockpiling the skills and courage the next world would need. Today, as we face rising seas and supercharged storms, that mindset feels less like mythology and more like a manual. But here's where the old stories get uncomfortable. The Norse didn't just accept collapse, they expected it. Their sagas are littered with warnings Loki's lies unraveling alliances, the greed of gods hastening doom. Sound familiar? When corporations drain aquifers until the wells run dry, or governments delay climate action for short-term profits, we're replaying the same fatal script. The Vikings would nod knowingly, they'd seen this before. The difference is they didn't pretend they could negotiate with the volcano, they packed their ships. Yet Ragnarok's most subversive lesson isn't about survival, it's about memory. After the fires cool and the floods recede, the myths tell of a new earth rising from the water, greener and fresher than before. But here's the catch, the surviving gods find chess pieces in the grass, remnants of the old world. The cycle continues, but nothing is truly forgotten. That's the heartbeat of Norse wisdom, not just adaptation but continuity, not just weathering the storm but carrying forward what matters. As we stare down our own era of upheaval, that might be the most vital skill of all, knowing what to let burn and what to keep. Hindu cosmology doesn't just tell stories, it measures time in heartbeats of the universe. Imagine a wheel turning endlessly, where creation and destruction aren't tragedies, but breaths. At the center of this rhythm stands Shiva, the destroyer, whose dance doesn't just end worlds, it makes space for new ones. When his feet stamp the ground, mountains crumble, but his outstretched hands also offer blessing. This isn't chaos, it's choreography. The Hindu concept of yugas or cosmic ages unfolds like seasons. The golden Satya Yuga, where humanity walks with gods, slowly giving way to the Kali Yuga, our current era of discord and disillusionment. But here's the twist, this isn't a downward spiral, it's a circle. When the Kali Yuga ends in cleansing fire and flood, the cycle resets. The world isn't lost, it's renewed. This cyclical vision stands in stark contrast to the linear apocalypses of Western tradition. In Christianity's Book of Revelation or Norse Ragnarok, the end is final, a last battle, a judgment day. But in Hindu thought, collapse is as natural as autumn leaves falling. The Bhagavata Purana describes the Kali Yuga's symptoms with eerie prescience. Rulers becoming thieves, families fracturing, the earth exploited until she's barren. Yet these aren't signs of eternal damnation, they're markers of a transition, like fever breaking before healing begins. When Shiva dances the universe to ashes, it's not vengeance. It's mercy. What if this ancient framework holds the key to facing modern crises without paralysis? Climate scientists warn of tipping points, ice sheets collapsing, forests burning, but Hindu cosmology reframes these not as doomsday, but as pralaya, the dissolution that precedes rebirth. Indigenous traditions from the Andes to Australia share similar cyclical worldviews, suggesting this isn't just philosophy, it's survival wisdom. The Kali Yuga's lesson isn't passivity, it's perspective. When the Ganges floods, devotees don't curse the river, they adapt their rituals to its rhythm. The brilliance of this model lies in its psychological resilience. Linear narratives of collapse can breed either denial or despair, two sides of the same paralyzed coin. But cyclical thinking invites action without attachment. Like a farmer planting seeds knowing storms will come, it prepares us to build even as we let go. Modern sustainability efforts echo this. Coral reefs regrown after bleaching, cities redesigned after floods. The dance continues. Perhaps that's why Hindu temples often depict Shiva's dance within a ring of fire, not as a prison but as a portal. The flames that consume also illuminate. As our own era's fractures widen, climate migrations, political upheavals, ecosystems unraveling, the old stories whisper a radical question. What if this isn't the end but the turning? The ground in Hawaii doesn't just tremble, it speaks. To those who know how to listen, every hiss of steam, every river of molten rock carries the voice of Pele, the goddess who shapes the islands with her bare hands. She isn't confined to ancient scrolls or dusty temples. She's in the crackle of lava meeting ocean, in the sulfur-scented mist that curls through rainforests. Locals tell of encounters with an elderly woman dressed in white, her hair wild as the trade winds, asking for food or shelter. Those who offer kindness might wake to find their gardens thriving, their fishing nets full. Those who turn her away, their homes sometimes lie in the path of the next eruption. This isn't superstition, it's a language of reciprocity, a way of understanding that the land isn't passive dirt, but a living being with its own will. Take the village of Kalapana, once a thriving community on the Big Island's eastern coast. In the late 1980s, Pele's lava flows swallowed its streets, its church, even its famed black sand beach. But here's what outsiders often miss. many residents didn't blame bad luck or faulty geology. They spoke of warnings ignored, of sacred lands paved over for resorts, of a balance disrupted. One elder described the lava not as destruction, but as correction plea reclaiming what was always hers. Today, new lava fields bristle with ohia lehua trees. Their crimson blossoms the first signs of rebirth. The message is clear: what the goddess takes, she can also renew. Modern volcanologists map magma chambers and predict flows down to the hour, but Hawaiian kupuna, or elders, still read subtler signs. The way certain birds vanish before an eruption, or how underground water tables shift weeks before the ground splits open, science and myth aren't rivals here. They're two lenses focusing on the same truth. When developers proposed building a geothermal plant near the active Kilauea crater in the 2000s, protests didn't just cite environmental reports. They invoked Pele's legacy, arguing that drilling into her body was tantamount to sacrilege. The project stalled. Whether you see that as spiritual wisdom or ecological prudence, the outcome is identical. Some places demand humility. This interplay of reverence and resilience shapes daily life in volcanic zones. Farmers plant crops knowing their fields might one day vanish, but they also know the ash will birth richer soil. Tourists snap photos of glowing lava, while locals leave offerings of gin, red flowers, or chants at the crater's edge. It's a dance of pragmatism and piety, where disaster preparedness includes both evacuation routes and cultural protocols. When the 2018 eruption forced thousands to flee, many paused to sing Oli or chants, asking permission to cross Pele's land. These aren't empty rituals, they're threads in a safety net woven from generations of lived experience. The deeper lesson of Pele's stories isn't about fearing nature's power. It's about recognizing our place within it. Western thought often frames volcanoes as obstacles to conquer or resources to exploit. Hawaiian wisdom asks a different question. What if the mountain isn't just a backdrop to human drama, but a main character? When lava swallows a highway, it's not an inconvenience, it's the island rewriting its own map. That shift in perspective changes everything. Climate scientists warn of rising seas and superstorms, but perhaps what we're missing isn't more data, but better stories, ones that remind us, as Pele does, that the Earth isn't a passive stage. It's a co-author of our fate, and it's been trying to tell us so for centuries. Deep beneath the snow-capped peak of Mount Fuji, the Earth trembles, not just with magma, but with meaning. To the ancient Japanese, these vibrations weren't geological accidents. They were the whispers of kami, the spirits woven into the land itself. When Fuji growled or spewed ash, it wasn't just a mountain erupting. It was a divine critique, a cosmic nudge urging communities to examine their harmony with the world. Shinto priests would perform rituals to appease the restless kami, not out of fear, but from a profound understanding. Nature's disruptions were conversations waiting to be decoded. Half a world away, the Greeks mapped their own moral landscape onto volcanic fury. When Thera exploded around 1600 BCE, obliterating the Minoan outpost of Akrotiri, survivors didn't see bad luck. They saw Zeus flexing his authority. Thera's caldera became a cautionary tale, immortalized in Plato's Atlantis story and etched into collective memory. Even the word volcano stems from Vulcan, the Roman forge god whose fiery temper mirrored the mountain's unpredictability. These cultures shared an instinct modern science often sidelines, that disasters aren't just physical events but narratives. A landslide isn't merely rocks falling, it's the mountain sighing under the weight of deforestation. A hurricane isn't just wind and water, it's the ocean's fever breaking after decades of abuse. This personification isn't primitive superstition, it's psychological brilliance. Studies show humans process trauma more effectively when framed as stories rather than statistics. After the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, Andaman Islanders who'd heeded ancestral warnings about the sea swallowing the land suffered fewer casualties than tourists reliant solely on modern alerts. Their myths weren't just folklore, they were survival algorithms honed over generations. Similarly, when Icelandic sagas described volcanoes as dragons waking, they encoded evacuation cues in memorable metaphors. Today, climate scientists speak in graphs and percentages, but the planet communicates in symbols we've forgotten how to read. Coral bleaching isn't just a chemical reaction, it's the reef's white flag of surrender. The Australian Black Summer fires of 2019 weren't random. They were the bush screaming after centuries of colonial fire suppression disrupted indigenous burning practices. Like the Greeks scrutinizing sheep entrails for divine messages, we now pass ice cores and atmospheric data, seeking patterns in the chaos. The tools have changed, but the quest remains to discern intent behind the violence. Perhaps the most radical lesson from these ancient perspectives isn't about fearing nature's wrath. It's about recognizing its agency. When Indonesian villagers leave offerings at the base of erupting Marapi, or when Maori elders speak of Tohara, the storm god, as a teacher rather than a punisher, they're engaging with the environment as a conscious partner. This shift reframes responsibility. If a river floods because you've stripped its banks of trees, that's not an act of God, it's a negotiation you failed. As climate disruptions intensify, this mythic mindset might be our most pragmatic tool. Data tells us what's happening, stories tell us why it matters. When Greenland's glaciers calve into the sea, it's not just ice melting, it's the world's oldest library dissolving, each berg a lost volume of Earth's history. The Japanese kami, the Hawaiian peel, the Norse Jörmungandr, they all carry the same urgent memo. Nature isn't a backdrop to human ambition. It's the director of the play, and we're not the only actors on stage. The curtain's rising on an era where listening might be the difference between thriving and becoming another civilization's cautionary myth. The labyrinth wasn't just a maze, it was a map of collective terror. Picture Crete in the wake of Thera's eruption, towering tsunamis swallowing coastal towns, ash turning noon to midnight, the very earth shaking as if the gods themselves were furious. In the ruins of Knossos, where frescoes of leaping dolphins suddenly lay buried under debris, the Minoans faced a horror beyond comprehension, and so they told a story. Not of plate tectonics or pyroclastic flows, but of a beast with the body of a man and the head of a bull, lurking in a twisting, inescapable labyrinth beneath the palace. The Minotaur wasn't just a monster, it was the perfect metaphor for an unpredictable force that demanded sacrifice, that couldn't be reasoned with, only survived. Archaeologists have found eerie parallels between the myth and the disaster. The sprawling layout of Minoan palaces, with their nested courtyards and sudden dead-end corridors, mirrors the labyrinth's disorientation. After Thera, these complexes didn't just collapse physically, they collapsed symbolically. The once great centers of trade and power became traps, their storerooms empty, their sacred spaces buried. Even the Minotaur's demand for Athenian youths takes on new meaning when you consider the eruption's aftermath. Crops failing, trade routes severed, an entire generation lost to hunger or desperation. The myth doesn't just describe a monster, it encodes the trauma of a civilization realizing its vulnerability. But here's where it gets fascinating. The Theseus legend isn't just about fear, it's about agency. A hero navigates the maze, slays the beast, and escapes with a thread guiding him back to daylight. That thread matters. It's hope woven into the narrative, a lifeline insisting that even in the darkest chaos, there's a way forward. Modern trauma psychologists call this post-traumatic growth, the process of rebuilding meaning after catastrophe. The Minoans may have fallen, but their story survived, repurposed by later Greeks as a tale of resilience. Today, we see echoes of this in disaster narratives. Survivors of hurricanes or wildfires recounting their experiences not just as victims, but as witnesses who lived to warn others. So what happens when a society lacks shared myths to process its crises? Look at our fractured modern responses to climate change or pandemics. Without unifying stories, we spin in separate labyrinths of denial, blame, or paralysis. Indigenous cultures often fare better. The Maori have ta'en Mahuta's battle to separate earth and sky as a metaphor for environmental balance. The Inuit have Sedna's severed fingers becoming sea creatures to explain ocean abundance. These aren't quaint fables, they're cognitive tools, passed down strategies for making sense of a chaotic world. Perhaps it's time we spun new threads. When Greta Thunberg speaks of the house on fire, she's not just describing data, she's invoking an image every child understands. When astronauts describe the overview effect, seeing Earth as a fragile blue marble, they're offering a modern creation myth for the space age. The Minotaur taught the ancients that monsters thrive in confusion, but they can be named, faced, and overcome. Our challenge isn't just to survive the maze, but to leave a thread for those who come after. A story that turns panic into purpose and collapse into a cautionary tale with an escape route. The sky didn't just rain fire on Sodom and Gomorrah, it rewrote the rules of morality. One moment, the twin cities thrived at the crossroads of trade routes, their wealth as legendary as their sins. The next, an inferno swallowed them whole, leaving behind a wasteland so barren the Bible claims even Lot's wife turned to salt for daring to look back. But here's what ancient scribes didn't record: the science behind the spectacle. Modern geologists studying the Dead Sea Rift Zone have found evidence of massive subsurface methane deposits, trapped like bubbles in a soda bottle. A single earthquake could have unleashed these gases, igniting them as they burst into the air, a phenomenon called a fuel-air explosion, capable of replicating the brimstone and fire described in Scripture. The ground near the ancient city of Tall El Hammam, a likely candidate for Sodom, shows layers of ash, melted pottery, and bone fragments charred at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees. This wasn't supernatural wrath, it was combustible chemistry. Yet the transformation of disaster into divine judgment reveals something deeper about human psychology. When the authors of Genesis framed Sodom's destruction as punishment for greed and cruelty, they weren't just explaining tragedy, they were weaponizing it. The message was clear: morality has consequences, and nature itself could be the enforcer. This pattern echoes globally. In Mesopotamian texts, the gods flood the world to cleanse human corruption. In Aztec lore, the fifth sun was born from the ashes of a previous era's decadence. Even secular societies cling to this instinct. Think of how commentators labeled Hurricane Katrina karma for Bourbon Street excesses, or how some called COVID nature's revenge for deforestation. But this framing cuts both ways. On one hand, moralizing catastrophe can foster accountability, pushing societies to examine their actions. The biblical prophets didn't just blame Sodom's fate on abstract wickedness, they specifically condemned its neglect of the poor and vulnerable. On the other hand, viewing disasters as cosmic payback risks paralyzing empathy. When earthquakes strike impoverished nations or wildfires ravage communities, labeling them punishment absolves us of responsibility to help, as if suffering were earned rather than random. Perhaps the most provocative question isn't whether Sodom burned, but why we still reach for mythological explanations when science offers clearer answers. Maybe because facts alone can't soothe our terror of chaos. A methane explosion is impersonal, indifferent. A god's wrath, however terrifying, at least implies order, a universe where someone's in charge, where suffering means something. As climate change amplifies disasters, we're forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The Earth isn't judging us, it's reacting. The fire next time won't care who's wicked or worthy. It will simply burn. That's the real legacy of Sodom and Gomorrah. Not a cautionary tale about divine retribution, but a mirror reflecting our desperate need to find narrative in ruin. When the next city burns, will we see only punishment or finally recognize the warning? Gilgamesh's flood wasn't just a story, it was a survival manual carved in cuneiform. Picture the Tigris and Euphrates rivers swelling beyond their banks, swallowing cities whole, leaving nothing but a thick layer of silt where bustling markets once stood. This wasn't fiction to the Mesopotamians, it was family history. When the epic's hero, Utnapishtim, builds a giant ark to weather the god's wrath, he's not just saving animals, he's preserving the blueprint of civilization itself. Parallels to Noah's tale are unmistakable, but Gilgamesh's version cuts deeper. Here, the flood isn't sent because humanity is wicked, it's because we're too noisy. The gods can't sleep. It's almost darkly comic, annihilation as divine noise cancellation. What makes this 4,000-year-old tablet so chilling isn't its spectacle, it's its specificity. Utnapishtim describes releasing birds to test the receding waters, a detail later echoed in Genesis. He mentions sealing his boat with bitumen, a technique still used by Iraqi marsh dwellers today. These aren't the vague strokes of legend, they're the fingerprints of lived experience. Archaeologists have found evidence of massive flooding around 2900 BCE, a layer of sediment stretching across ancient Ur and Shuruppak like a scar. The myth, it seems, was a vessel for trauma, a way to make sense of the unimaginable. But here's where Gilgamesh flips the script. Unlike Noah, who receives his warning directly from God, Utnapishtim gets tipped off by a lesser deity sneaking behind her peers' backs. There's no moral grandstanding about sin, just gods acting on whim, then regretting their overreaction. When the waters calm, they gift Utnapishtim immortality, not as a reward for virtue, but as an apology for nearly wiping out their favorite project. The message is startlingly modern. Disasters aren't always moral lessons. Sometimes they're just chaos, and survival depends on who whispers the right warnings. This nuance matters today. As Greenland's ice sheets melt and megastorms batter coastlines, we're stuck in an old debate. Are we being punished or just collateral damage in a system pushed past its limits? Gilgamesh suggests a third option, that renewal begins when we stop looking for blame and start listening to the whispers. The marsh Arabs of southern Iraq still build their floating homes from reeds, just as their ancestors did millennia ago. Their resilience isn't rooted in defiance of nature, but in fluent adaptation to its rhythms. The epic's real legacy isn't the flood, it's the quiet understanding that civilization isn't a fortress. It's a raft, and the best builders leave room to float higher. Perhaps that's why this story outlasted empires. When Babylonian scribes etched it into clay, they weren't preserving superstition. They were passing down a cognitive toolkit. The flood myths spanning from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica all share that transformative arc, destruction, then rebirth. Not a dead end, but a reset. As our own storms gather, we do well to remember Utnapishtim's pragmatism. The gods might rage or doze, but the ark builders, the ones who heed the whispers and work with the currents, they're the ones who write the next chapter. The Aztecs didn't just predict the end, they counted down to it. Their cosmology pulsed with the rhythm of collapsing suns, each era snuffed out by a different catastrophe. Jaguars devouring the first, hurricanes leveling the second, fire raining on the third, floods swallowing the fourth. Now they believed humanity walked under the fifth sun, destined to perish in a storm of earthquakes, a prophecy carved into the very stones of their temples. But this wasn't passive fatalism, it was a call to action. Every sunrise wasn't guaranteed. It had to be earned through blood and smoke, through the beating hearts offered to Tenatia, the sun god. The Aztecs didn't wait for disaster. They fought it with ritual, turning their terror into a kind of cosmic negotiation. Look closer, and their obsession with collapse wasn't just spiritual, it was geological. The Valley of Mexico, where their capital Tenochtitlan rose, sat ringed by active volcanoes like Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl. Earthquakes weren't metaphors here, they were weekly reminders of the Earth's instability. When priests spoke of the fifth sun's end, they weren't spinning fairy tales, they were extrapolating from lived experience. The same way modern seismologists study fault lines to predict the big one, Aztec scholars tracked omens, comets, two-headed calves, strange lights in the sky. Their methods were different, but their goal was identical: to read the signs before it was too late. What's startling isn't their violence, but their vulnerability. These were architects of floating gardens, builders of aqueducts, masters of astronomy, yet they knew their achievements were temporary. Their sacrifices weren't just about appeasing gods, they were about maintaining equilibrium. In their worldview, blood was currency, a literal life force required to keep the machinery of the cosmos running. Modern audiences recoil at the scale of their rituals, thousands sacrificed in a single ceremony, but consider the parallels. Today, we don't offer hearts to the sun. We pump billions into renewable energy, carbon capture, flood barriers. The scale is different, but the underlying anxiety is the same. The fear that civilization is a fragile wager against forces far older and stronger than ourselves. The fifth sun's legacy isn't in its brutality, but in its brutal honesty. The Aztecs didn't sugarcoat the stakes. Their calendar stone, often mislabeled a doomsday clock, was actually a map of resilience, a reminder that survival required constant effort. Compare that to our modern climate debates, where denial and delay still dominate. The Aztecs would have found our hesitation baffling. When your entire culture believes the world could end tomorrow, you don't debate policy. You act, yet there's a twist in their story that often gets overlooked. The fifth sun wasn't just about destruction, it was about transformation. Aztec poets wrote of the eras, and not with despair, but with a strange hope. The earthquakes would come, yes, but they'd also cleanse, making way for something new. This wasn't nihilism, it was cyclical thinking at its most pragmatic. Modern sustainability advocates echo this when they speak of adaptive collapse, the idea that sometimes systems need to fail to evolve. The Aztecs might have phrased it differently, but the core insight is the same. Endings aren't always endings. Sometimes they're the first tremors of a world rearranging itself. So the next time you hear a climate report warning of tipping points, or feel the ground shake beneath your feet, remember the fifth sun. Not for its altars slick with blood, but for its unflinching clarity. The Aztecs didn't have science, but they had something just as vital: the courage to stare into the abyss and admit it was staring back. Their prophecies weren't just predictions, they were mirrors reflecting a truth we're still learning, that civilizations don't fall because the gods are angry. They fall because we forget how fragile we are and how hard we have to fight to stay alive. The ruins of Delphi aren't just crumbling marble, they're a geological time capsule. Perched on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, this sacred site pulsed with more than just spiritual energy. Beneath the temple's foundations, intersecting fault lines exhaled ethylene, a sweet-smelling gas known to induce trances. Picture the Pythia, Apollo's high priestess, seated atop a tripod above these fissures, breathing in vapors that blurred the line between earth and vision. Her cryptic prophecies delivered in groans and fragmented poetry weren't mere theatrics. They were the literal voice of the ground itself, distorted through human lungs. Modern geologists discovered this in the 1990s, finding traces of methane and ethylene in Delphi Springs gases that could explain the priestess's altered states. But here's what's even more revealing. The oracle's predictions often mirrored seismic activity. When she spoke of earth shudders or the gods stirring beneath, she might have been sensing precursor tremors imperceptible to others. The ancients didn't dismiss these connections as coincidence. They revered them. To them, the earth wasn't just rock, it was a living oracle, its tremors and gases carrying messages from the divine. This fusion of tectonics and prophecy wasn't unique to Greece. In Japan, shrine maidens at Mount Osor still interpret volcanic steam as whispers from the dead. In Iceland, medieval sagas describe seeress inhaling fumes from hot springs to glimpse the future. These traditions share a profound insight that the earth doesn't just threaten, it communicates. Today, we've swapped priestesses for seismographs, but the essential question remains. When a fault line groans or a volcano exhales sulfur, are we merely measuring danger or missing a deeper dialogue? Consider how the Delphic oracle framed her guidance. Cities on the brink of war didn't ask yes or no questions. They sought signs to interpret. Similarly, modern sensors can predict quakes, but they can't tell us what those quakes mean for our collective choices. Maybe the lesson isn't in the gas or the tremor, but in the humility to listen. When the Pythia warned Croesus that invading Persia would destroy a great empire, he assumed it meant his enemies. The empire that fell was his own. Delphi's real legacy isn't its accuracy, it's its ambiguity. The priestess spoke in riddles because the earth itself resists simple answers. As we track magma shifts and fault stresses with satellites, we're still grappling with the same existential riddle: how to live on a planet that breathes fire and whispers warnings. The gases may have faded, but the ground beneath Delphi still hums with old energy. Not prophecy, perhaps, but a reminder that the Earth's most vital messages aren't always shouted. Sometimes they rise quietly through cracks in the stone, waiting for someone to kneel and listen. Iceland doesn't just endure its volcanoes, it dances with them. Picture a land where glaciers sprawl like frozen oceans, only to be undercut by rivers of molten rock, where geysers erupt with clockwork precision, and the very ground exhales steam like a sleeping dragon. Here, myths aren't just stories, they're survival guides etched into lava fields. Take Surtur, the fire giant from Norse legend, who waits beneath the earth with a flaming sword, destined to unleash infernos at Ragnarok. To medieval Icelanders, every eruption wasn't just geology, it was Surtur stirring, a preview of the world's end. Yet instead of paralyzing them, this belief fostered a unique resilience. They built farms on volcanic soil, channeled geothermal heat into bathhouses, and composed sagas amid tremors, their secret viewing disaster as both threat and teacher. When Christianity reached Iceland's shores, something remarkable happened. Rather than abandoning old gods like Surtur, they wove them into new narratives. Priests called eruptions God's wrath, but locals whispered of elves and trolls battling beneath the earth, a fusion of faith and folklore that turned seismic chaos into a spiritual dialogue. The 13th century eruption of Hekla was said to be the mouth of hell itself, yet nearby monasteries kept meticulous records of its activity. This wasn't contradiction, it was pragmatism. By personifying volcanoes, they could negotiate with them, leaving offerings at fissures, avoiding construction on elf habitats, and reading the landscape for warnings. Modern volcanologists now confirm what the sagas hinted. Certain lava flows consistently stop at the same invisible boundaries, as if respecting ancient agreements. This mythic pragmatism shaped Iceland's most ingenious adaptations. After the devastating Loki eruption of 1783, which spewed toxic clouds across Europe and triggered famines, survivors didn't flee, they innovated. They dug pits to capture acidic rainwater for dyeing wool, turned ash into mortar, and used sulfur to preserve fish. Today, that same ingenuity powers geothermal plants harnessing Surtur's fury to heat 90% of Icelandic homes. The mythic fire giant, once a bringer of doom, now warms nurseries and powers greenhouses growing bananas near the Arctic Circle. It's a lesson in alchemy transforming fear into utility. What makes Iceland's approach extraordinary isn't just its technology, but its storytelling. While other nations build walls against nature, Icelanders compose poems to it. When Eyjafjallajökull erupted in 2010, grounding flights across Europe, Reykjavik's mayor appeared on TV not with disaster statistics, but with a recitation of medieval verses about the Earth's fiery breath. Tourists stranded in ash-covered villages were invited to bake bread using geothermal heat, turning chaos into connection. This cultural reflex, disaster as narrative rather than nuisance, may explain why Iceland consistently ranks among the world's happiest nations despite its hazards. The deeper truth in these fire and ice myths isn't about appeasing spirits, it's about mastering perspective. Psychologists call it benefit finding, the ability to spot opportunity in crisis. When your origin story features volcanoes birthing islands and glaciers carving valleys, you grow up fluent in change. Compare this to how modern cities panic at the first flood or heat wave, as if nature has broken some unspoken contract. Icelanders never had that illusion. Their myths prepared them for a simple truth. The ground will shake, the ice will melt, and survival belongs to those who listen to the land's oldest stories, especially when they roar. H.P. Lovecraft didn't invent cosmic horror. He unearthed it from the depths of human dread and dressed it in modern garb. His pantheon of ancient, slumbering deities like Yog-Sothoth and Cthulhu didn't punish humanity for its sins. They barely noticed it existed. These entities weren't gods in the traditional sense, but forces of nature personified, volcanic, chaotic, and utterly indifferent. Where the Aztecs sacrificed to appease their sun god or the Hawaiians left offerings for Pele, Lovecraft's protagonists stumbled upon truth so horrifying they shattered their minds. This wasn't divine vengeance, it was the universe yawning. The brilliance of Lovecraft's mythos lies in its timing. He wrote during the early 20th century, when science was peeling back layers of reality faster than culture could process them. Einstein's relativity made time fluid, telescopes revealed unfathomable cosmic voids, and seismographs traced the Earth's restless stirrings. Suddenly, the old moral frameworks for disaster, the idea that floods or eruptions were lessons or punishments, felt quaint. Lovecraft's stories captured this dissonance. In The Call of Cthulhu, the titular entity doesn't rise from the ocean to judge humanity. It simply wakes, and its mere existence drives people to madness. The eruption isn't the climax, it's the aftermath. This shift from moralistic collapse to existential dread mirrors our modern climate crisis. We've moved beyond seeing hurricanes or wildfires as divine retribution. Now, we confront them as emergent properties of complex systems we've destabilized. There's no morality in a carbon molecule, no justice in a heat dome. Like Lovecraft's protagonists, we're grasping at explanations while standing on fracturing ground. When a glacier calves into the sea, it's not angry, it's obeying physics. That's the true horror, not that the universe is malevolent, but that it's indifferent. Yet even in this bleak vision, storytelling persists as a lifeline. Lovecraft's characters don't just succumb. They document, they warn, they pass along their cursed knowledge like a baton. In our era, climate scientists play a similar role, translating raw data into narratives that might spur action. The UN's IPCC reports could be read as modern-day versions of the Necronomicon grim tomes filled with prophecies most would rather ignore. The difference is where Lovecraft's protagonists were powerless, we're not. Solar panels and reforestation won't placate a vengeful god, but they might rebalance an unstable system. What makes Lovecraft's myths endure isn't their hopelessness, but their honesty. They strip away the comforting illusions that disasters happen for a reason, forcing us to confront chaos head-on. The ancients had Pele and Poseidon. We have entropy and feedback loops, but the imperative remains the same, to keep telling stories, especially, when they terrify us. Because in the end, the only thing scarier than a universe that doesn't care is one we've stopped trying to understand. The phoenix isn't just a bird, it's a cosmic clockwork. Picture this: every 500 years, according to Greek legend, the creature builds a nest of aromatic branches, sets itself ablaze, and rises from the ashes, reborn. But here's what often gets overlooked: the phoenix doesn't just resurrect unchanged. Its renewal is an upgrade, a shimmering evolution. The Egyptians knew this when they linked their Bennu bird to the Nile's annual floods, which stripped the land bare only to fertilize it with fresh silt. The Chinese Feng Huang, often paired with the dragon, wasn't just a symbol of fire but of balance, its cyclical rebirth harmonizing yin and yang. Even the Aztecs had their own fiery avian, the Huitzilopochtli hummingbird, whose death and resurrection mirrored the sun's daily journey through the underworld. These aren't just pretty metaphors, they're ancient blueprints for resilience. What makes the phoenix myth so radical is its rejection of finality. Most apocalyptic narratives, from Ragnarok to Revelation, end with a period. The phoenix ends with a semicolon. Its destruction isn't a punishment but a necessity, like a forest fire clearing dead wood so new seedlings can bask in sunlight. Modern ecologists call this disturbance ecology, the understanding that ecosystems often need disruption to thrive. The giant sequoias of California, some of Earth's oldest living things, rely on fire to open their cones and release seeds. Indigenous cultures practiced controlled burns for millennia, knowing that what looks like loss is often the first step in a longer dance. The phoenix, then, isn't just a fantastical creature, it's a mirror held up to nature's deepest rhythms. This symbolism pulses through today's most urgent conversations about collapse. When urban planners talk about failing gracefully in the face of climate change, they're channeling phoenix logic, designing cities to absorb shocks like floods or heat waves, then reorganize stronger. Detroit's transformation from bankrupt industrial relic to a hub of urban farming and tech isn't just economic recovery. It's a phoenix story written in abandoned auto plants turned hydroponic gardens. Even personal resilience strategies echo the myth therapists now teach: post-traumatic growth. The idea that surviving adversity can spark creativity, empathy, and renewed purpose. The phoenix doesn't just endure, it metabolizes its own destruction into fuel. But here's where the myth challenges us: the phoenix doesn't rise by accident. Its rebirth requires active participation, gathering the right branches, choosing the fire. Similarly, societies facing collapse can't just wait for renewal, they must prepare for it. Japan's disaster parks, where children practice earthquake drills on playgrounds designed to simulate rubble, or the Netherlands' floating neighborhoods built to adapt to rising seas, aren't just infrastructure, they're nests woven in advance. The phoenix's lesson isn't passive hope, it's disciplined readiness. Perhaps that's why this myth endures when others fade. It doesn't promise salvation or damnation, just the inevitability of change and the invitation to meet it with wings spread. When a coral reef bleaches white, it looks like death, but beneath the surface, algae-resistant polyps sometimes reclaim the skeleton, building something new atop the old. That's the phoenix's whisper across millennia, not that we'll avoid the flames, but that we might yet learn to fly from them. 70,000 years ago, the sky didn't just darken, it vanished. When Indonesia's Toba supervolcano erupted, it didn't merely shake the earth, it rewrote the rules of survival. Plumes of ash shot 20 miles into the atmosphere, blotting out the sun for years. Global temperatures plummeted, turning lush landscapes into frozen wastelands overnight. Geneticists studying mitochondrial DNA found something startling. Around this time, the human population may have dwindled to just a few thousand breeding pairs, a brush with extinction so close we can still trace its fingerprints in our genes. This wasn't just a disaster, it was an evolutionary bottleneck, a moment when our species teetered on the edge of oblivion. Yet here's the paradox, this near annihilation might explain why we're here at all. The survivors of Toba didn't just endure, they carried forward something unexpected, a cultural immune system. Anthropologists point to a surge in symbolic artifacts after the eruption. Intricate beads, ochre paintings, advanced tools. Faced with environmental collapse, our ancestors didn't retreat into mere survival mode. They doubled down on storytelling, art, and social cohesion. The very traits that made us human became our lifeline. This aligns eerily with myths from indigenous Australian Dreamtime to Sumerian epics, where Golden Age narratives often describe a fall from primordial harmony into a harsher world. These aren't just fanciful tales, they could be ancestral memories, passed down through generations like genetic code. Consider the Kalahari Bushmen stories of a time when the sun grew cold, or the Andaman Islanders' legends of a great fire in the sky that brought famine. These oral traditions, isolated across continents, share uncanny parallels with the geological record of Toba's aftermath. It's as if the trauma of volcanic winter etched itself into our collective psyche, resurfacing in metaphors and warnings. Modern disaster psychologists call this cultural memory, a way for societies to encode survival strategies in myth, ensuring that even if one generation forgets, the story remembers. What makes the Toba event so resonant today isn't just its scale, but its aftermath. The humans who weathered that catastrophe didn't do it with technology or brute strength. They did it by innovating not just tools, but social bonds. Shared stories became shelters against the cold. Cooperative child rearing and food sharing turned into evolutionary advantages. In a way, Toba forged us twice, once in the fires of near extinction, and again in the crucible of community. Now, as we face our own planetary crises, climate disruption, biodiversity loss, the lesson isn't that collapse is inevitable. It's that recovery is encoded in us. The same genes that carried our ancestors through volcanic winters carry us now. The difference is, we don't have to wait for natural selection to save us. We have science, global communication, the ability to anticipate and adapt, but we also have something older, the stories. When Indigenous elders speak of all our relations, or when climate activists invoke intergenerational justice, they're tapping into that deep time resilience. Toba reminds us catastrophe isn't the end of the story. It's often the first rough draft of survival. The summer of 1816 should have been warm. Instead, farmers in New England woke to frost in July, watching helplessly as their crops blackened in the fields. Birds dropped dead mid-flight from the cold, and starving families ground tree bark into flour just to fill their stomachs. Half a world away, the culprit roared unseen. Mount Tambora in Indonesia had erupted the previous year, pumping enough sulfur into the stratosphere to wrap the planet in a sun-blocking shroud. They called it the year without a summer, But it wasn't the first time volcanoes rewrote human history through hunger. Centuries before Tambora, the Irish described similar horrors in their myth of the Fomorians, monstrous beings who blighted crops and demanded tribute in grain. These weren't just boogeymen, they were metaphors for the unpredictability of harvests in a land where a single ash cloud from Iceland could mean starvation. The Inca, nestled between Andean volcanoes, told of Supe, an underworld god who swallowed the sun, leaving fields frozen. What sounds like fantasy was actually observational science in narrative form. By attributing famine to supernatural forces, these cultures encoded critical lessons. Diversify your crops, store surplus, and respect the rhythms of the land. The brilliance of these myths lies in their practicality. When the Icelandic Lakagígar fissure erupted in 1783, its toxic fog didn't just kill livestock, it altered weather patterns for years, triggering famines as far away as Egypt. Yet in Japan, where Mount Asoma erupted the same year, records show fewer deaths. Why? Centuries of yakimochi legends, stories of fire rice cakes offered to appease mountain spirits, had ingrained habits of communal granaries and terraced farming resilient to climate shocks. The stories weren't just entertainment, they were survival algorithms disguised as folklore. Today, as climate change destabilizes growing seasons, these ancient warnings gain new urgency. Modern farmers battling unpredictable rains might recognize the Fomorians' curse in shifting pest migrations or unseasonal droughts. The difference is we no longer blame demons, we track jet streams and carbon concentrations. But the core challenge remains the same: how to feed civilizations when the atmosphere itself becomes unstable. Perhaps that's why initiatives like Norway's Doomsday Vault, preserving global crop seeds inside an Arctic mountain, feels so mythic. They're not just refrigerators, they're modern versions of the Inca's Colca storage houses, built to outlast the next great darkness. The most haunting lesson from these famine myths isn't about suffering, it's about foresight. When the Khmer Empire collapsed in the 15th century, archaeologists found evidence of their final years, hurriedly built shrines to the Naga water spirits as monsoon patterns failed. They'd misinterpreted the cause but recognized the crisis. Today, as rice paddies parch and wheat belts flood, we're left with a question sharper than any volcanic glass. Will our solutions be as enduring as our stories? Laki's eruption didn't just crack open the earth, it cracked open history. In 1783, this Icelandic fissure unleashed an 8-month-long nightmare, vomiting enough toxic gas to blanket Europe in a suffocating haze. Sunlight dimmed to an eerie twilight, crops withered under acid rain, and livestock dropped dead from fluorine poisoning. The famine that followed wasn't just local, it rippled across continents, from the emerald fields of Ireland to the vineyards of France. Bread prices skyrocketed, hunger riots erupted, and whispers of royal incompetence grew louder in the streets of Paris. Historians still debate the exact chain of causality, but the timing is haunting. Just 6 years after Laki's last gasp, the Bastille fell. The eruption didn't cause the French Revolution, but it might have been the spark that lit the powder keg. This interplay of disaster and upheaval isn't new. It's written into humanity's oldest warnings. Mesopotamian kings blamed droughts for their downfalls. Aztec rulers interpreted eclipses as divine displeasure, and Norse sagas wove famine into their apocalyptic visions of Ragnarok. What makes Laki different is the paper trail. We have weather reports, grain prices, peasant petitions, documents that let us trace how environmental stress bends the arc of societies. When Icelandic lava flows poisoned their own soil, forcing families to eat lichen or boil leather for soup, it wasn't attributed to angry gods, but the outcome mirrored mythic patterns. a breaking point where nature's indifference exposed human fragility. The genius of ancient collapse narratives lies in their holistic view of disaster. Polynesian stories of Pele's eruptions often include societal warnings, greedy chiefs hoarding resources, neglected protocols for sharing food. Similarly, when Egyptian pharaohs failed to prepare for Nile floods, the ensuing chaos was framed as Maat, the cosmic order, reasserting balance. Lackey's aftermath followed this script. French peasants starved while aristocrats feasted, exposing fractures that had festered for generations. The eruption didn't create these inequities, it illuminated them, much like volcanic lightning reveals a landscape's contours in stark relief. Modern climate researchers call this threat multiplier theory, the idea that environmental shocks amplify existing vulnerabilities. Syria's civil war, for instance, followed a record drought that displaced farming communities. But where contemporary analysis relies on data sets, myths package these insights as morality tales. The Greek story of King Minos, whose arrogance triggered earthquakes and plagues, or the Chinese legend of the Yellow Emperor losing the mandate of heaven after natural disasters, these weren't just fables. They were cognitive tools for connecting ecological and political instability. Lackey's legacy offers a chilling counterpoint to these ancient narratives. Without the framework of divine retribution, 18th century Europe struggled to interpret its suffering. Some blamed miasmatic air, others saw God's punishment for Enlightenment heresies. The lack of a cohesive story might explain the revolution's ferocity. When chaos has no narrative container, it spills into violence. Contrast this with Iceland's own response. Though a quarter of their population perished, survivors adapted by developing new fishing techniques and communal aid networks, echoing the collective resilience baked into their sagas. The line between myth and history isn't as clear as we pretend. Both are attempts to impose order on chaos to find meaning in suffering. When Roman historians described Pompeii's fall as vengeance for decadence, or when Hopi elders speak of previous worlds destroyed by human greed, they're not just explaining events, they're prescribing values. Lackey's haze didn't carry moral lessons, but its aftermath revealed a truth the ancients understood. Civilizations don't collapse from eruptions alone. They collapse when the ground shakes and no one's left to hold each other steady. Mount Tambora's eruption in 1815 didn't just chill the globe, it rewired human imagination. While most know 1816 as the year without a summer that birthed Mary Shelley's Frankenstein during a stormy Swiss retreat, few realize the same volcanic winter spawned a very different kind of monster in Eastern Europe. As crops rotted in the unseasonable frost, desperate villagers from Transylvania to Serbia began exhuming their dead, convinced vampiric spirits were draining the life from their communities. What they found in those graves wasn't supernatural, just tragically misunderstood. Malnourished corpses, their decomposition slowed by the cold, often appeared eerily preserved, with blood still pooled in their organs. Bloated bellies ruptured, releasing fluids mistaken for fresh feeding. To terrified onlookers, this wasn't science, it was proof the dead were rising to feast on the living. This panic wasn't mere superstition, it was pattern seeking in overdrive. When famine weakens bodies and minds, and the very weather defies explanation, the human brain defaults to narratives that restore a sense of control, however dark. The vampire hunts mirrored ancient responses to collapse. Hittite texts blamed plagues on angry storm gods, while medieval Europeans scapegoated Jews and witches for the Black Death. The mechanism is identical, transforming random suffering into intentional evil, because even a malevolent force is less terrifying than chaos with no meaning at all. Yet there's a chilling twist to Tambora's legacy. Modern forensic studies show many, Vampire burials involved brutal precaution sickles placed around necks to decapitate the corpse if it stirred, stones wedged into mouths to prevent biting. These weren't rote rituals, they were acts of profound desperation by people watching their children starve. The same psychological drive that today fuels conspiracy theories about engineered pandemics or climate hoaxes once filled graveyards with staked bodies. When systems fail, we'd rather invent villains than face our fragility. The deeper lesson here isn't about vampires or volcanoes, it's about the stories we cling to when the world grows unstable. Gothic literature and folk horror flourished after Tambora because art, like myth, helps process collective trauma. Shelley's creature, stitched from corpses and abandoned by his creator, mirrored societies shattered by forces beyond their control. The vampire panics, meanwhile, revealed how easily fear metastasizes in the absence of clear explanations. Today, as climate disruptions trigger new migrations and food insecurities, Tambora's shadow looms large. Will we respond with the rigor of science or the desperation of villagers digging up their dead? The answer might determine whether future generations remember us as problem solvers or protagonists in their own dark folktales. Deucalion's story begins with a warning the kind whispered through generations before it's carved into stone. In Greek mythology, Zeus, disgusted by humanity's corruption, decides to wipe the slate clean with a flood. But one man, Deucalion, and his wife Pirha are spared, floating in a chest until the waters recede. When they land on Mount Parnassus, an oracle tells them to repopulate the earth by throwing stones over their shoulders. These aren't just rocks, they transform into people, becoming the ancestors of a new world. At first glance, it's a fantastical tale, but dig deeper, and something startling emerges. This myth might be a fossilized memory of real survival strategies after ancient environmental collapse. Consider the science of genetic bottlenecks, events where a species' population shrinks drastically, leaving only a handful of survivors to rebuild. Around 12,000 years ago, as the last ice age retreated, melting glaciers caused sea levels to rise nearly 400 feet, swallowing coastal civilizations worldwide. For scattered groups clinging to high ground, the experience would have felt apocalyptic. The parallels to Deucalion's story are uncanny. A few survivors, a mountaintop refuge, and the literal rebuilding of humanity from what's left, stones symbolizing the hard, unyielding resilience required to start anew. Even the act of throwing stones backward could reflect a cultural taboo against looking directly at traumatic origins, focusing instead on moving forward. This idea of myth as coded history isn't just speculation. Indigenous Australian stories describe coastlines that match Ice Age geography, preserved orally for millennia. The Klamath people of North America tell of Mount Mazoma's eruption 7,000 years ago, an event later confirmed by geologists. These narratives function like time capsules, preserving critical survival information in metaphor. When Deucalion's stones become people, it might encode a lesson about resourcefulness, that even the most barren circumstances can birth renewal if you know how to read the land. What makes these stories urgent today isn't their antiquity, it's their insight into human adaptability. Modern climate models predict rising seas displacing millions, yet we're still pouring concrete into floodplains like the ancients who rebuilt Troy on the same earthquake-prone shores. Deucalion's myth offers a counterpoint. Instead of resisting change, it embraces transformation. The stones turned, people suggest that survival isn't about clinging to what was, but reimagining what could be. The most haunting question isn't whether these myths are true, it's why we stopped listening to them. Science gives us precise sea level projections, but folklore offers something equally vital: emotional templates for resilience. When the Sami people speak of Stallo, a greedy giant who melts glaciers by burning too much fuel, or when Cherokee stories link deforestation to the wrath of the thunder beings, they're not just explaining nature, they're prescribing ethics. Deucalion didn't just survive the flood, he carried forward the wisdom to prevent the next one. As our own storms gather, we're left to wonder, will our myths be warnings or epitaphs? In Iceland's mist-shrouded lava fields, a group of modern heathens gathers at the foot of Hekla volcano, offering mead and song to the fire giants of old. This isn't a historical reenactment, it's a living spiritual practice, one that never fully disappeared despite centuries of Christianity. Across the Pacific, on Hawaii's Big Island, locals still leave offerings of gin, red flowers, and chants at Kilauea's steaming vents, honoring Pele as their ancestors did. What outsiders might dismiss as folklore or tourist spectacle is something far more profound, a millennia-old dialogue between humans and the forces that shape their world. These traditions aren't about superstition, they're about symbiosis. When an Icelandic farmer avoids building on an elf hill, or when Hawaiian activists block developers from drilling into Pele's sacred ground, they're enacting a form of ecological ethics older than environmental science. The gods are just the language, the grammar is respect. Modern geologists might map magma chambers with satellites, but these communities navigate the land through stories, recognizing that volcanoes aren't just hazards or resources, they're actors in a shared landscape. The brilliance of these practices lies in their pragmatism. In Bali, where daily offerings to Agung volcano coexist with seismometers, villagers have maintained terraced rice fields for centuries by treating the mountain as a partner rather than a foe. When Agung rumbled to life in 2017, evacuation orders flowed seamlessly alongside temple processions. Compare this to societies that view nature as inert matter to be conquered, like the Spanish colonizers who built Mexico City atop Tenochtitlan's lake, only to watch their grand capital sink into the soft earth. The myths weren't wrong, the engineers were. Now, as climate chaos exposes the fragility of modern infrastructure, these ancient relationships are gaining unexpected validation. Iceland, where nearly 90% of homes are heated by geothermal energy, has literally plugged into the power its ancestors revered. Hawaiian biologists studying lava-resistant plants work alongside cultural practitioners who recite chants about Pele's regenerative fires. The line between traditional knowledge and cutting-edge science blurs when both agree. Survival requires listening to the land's own vocabulary. Perhaps the most radical lesson here isn't about worship, but humility. Western environmentalism often frames nature as a victim to save or a problem to fix. Volcano cultures suggest a third option, seeing it as a teacher. When Maori elders speak of Taranaki Mountain's grief after being separated from its volcanic siblings by geologic forces, they're not personifying a landform, they're articulating an interconnectedness that modern ecology now confirms. The same tectonic stresses that build volcanoes also nourish soil, regulate oceans, and yes, threaten cities. The question isn't whether we can control these forces, but whether we can learn their rhythms well enough to dance with them. This isn't about abandoning science for spirituality. It's about recognizing that data alone can't inspire the reverence needed to shift human behavior. Climate reports tell us carbon levels are rising. Myths tell us the sky god is angry. Both are true in their own language. As Indonesia's Merapi volcano spews ash over Java, farmers don't just check evacuation routes. They groom the mountain's bridle path, a ritual clearing said to soothe its temper. Geologists confirm the practice reduces landslide risks by preventing debris buildup. The myth and the math arrive at the same conclusion through different paths. The old volcano deities never left. They simply adapted, whispering now through climate models and disaster preparedness plans. When a Hawaiian elder says Pele's fires cleanse as they destroy, or an Icelandic poet describes Surtur's flames powering green energy grids, they're offering more than poetry, they're mapping a way forward. Not back to some primitive past, but toward a future where respect for nature's power isn't quaint, it's essential. The collapses foretold in myths weren't inevitable. They were choices, and so is what comes next. Corporate giants loom over our modern world like the titans of old, their shadows stretching across ecosystems and economies alike. Where ancient myths spoke of primordial beings warring with the gods, today's boardrooms and factories wield power that rivals the divine, drilling into sacred grounds, rerouting rivers, and bending the very atmosphere to their will. The parallels are unsettling. Just as the Titans defied cosmic order, these entities often operate beyond the reach of earthly laws, treating nature not as a living system but as a ledger to be balanced. Yet unlike the Titans, who are bound in Tartarus by Zeus, our corporate Titans face no thunderbolts, only the slow, creeping consequences of their own excess. Take the myth of Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods to give to humanity, a gift that came with a price. His punishment was eternal torment, chained to a rock as an eagle devoured his liver each day. Modern industries fire fossil fuels has unleashed a similar paradox, unprecedented progress paired with planetary fever. The difference, Prometheus knew his theft would bring suffering. Our Titans, armed with spreadsheets and lobbying power, often dismiss the warnings as collateral damage. The result is a world where profit margins soar while forests burn and oceans acidify, a real-world Ragnarok playing out in quarterly reports. But myths aren't just cautionary tales, they're frameworks for understanding. When activists frame oil executives as modern-day Hades, plundering the underworld's riches while ignoring the cries of the damned, it's not hyperbole. It's storytelling as strategy. Abstract terms like carbon emissions and resource depletion rarely stir the soul, but a narrative of hubris and fall. That's primal. Indigenous protesters blocking pipelines invoke the spirit of Pele defending her volcanic home. Climate lawsuits echo the furies of Greek myth, relentless in their pursuit of justice. These aren't just metaphors, they're psychological levers, turning distant crises into battles between archetypes we've recognized for millennia. The irony is that corporations already use mythology, just of a different kind. Tech CEOs pose as Promethean visionaries, their logos sleek as Olympian sigils. Fast fashion brands spin Cinderella stories of reinvention, while their garments pile up like cursed gifts from the gods. The question isn't whether myths shape our world, but which ones will dominate. Will we keep worshipping the titans of endless growth, or resurrect older stories, ones that remind us of reciprocity and limits? The Maori concept of Kaishiakatanga, or guardianship, or the Norse belief that even Yggdrasil must be watered daily to survive, offer blueprints for a different relationship with power. Perhaps the most subversive lesson lies in how these ancient stories end. Titans fall. Prometheus is unchained. The cycle renews. Our corporate titans, for all their might, are no more invincible than the gods they mimic. Shareholder revolts, green investing, worker uprisings, these are the modern equivalents of divine retribution. The myths whispered it long ago. No power thrives forever unchecked. The fire stolen must one day be returned, or the eagle will come for us all. From Pele's fiery tears to Atlantis's sunken spires, these myths teach us that collapse is never truly sudden. It's the crescendo of ignored whispers. The Minoans didn't vanish in a single eruption at Thera. They faded after decades of rebuilding on fragile coastlines, dismissing the tremors as minor disturbances. Pompeii's streets weren't empty when Vesuvius roared. They were bustling with merchants haggling over wine, children chasing dogs, all oblivious to the mountain's gathering fury until it was too late. Hubris isn't just arrogance, it's the illusion of control, the belief that our cities and systems stand apart from nature's rhythms rather than woven into them. Yet woven through these cautionary tales is a thread of radical hope. The phoenix doesn't just burn, it rises brighter. The Norse didn't cower before Ragnarok. They prepared for it, knowing the world that emerged after the fire and frost would be fertile with new possibilities. Indigenous stories from Hawaii to the Andes don't end with destruction. They pivot to renewal, emphasizing that survival isn't about resisting change but adapting to it. When Maori elders speak of Tikor, the void from which all life springs, or when Hindu texts describe Shiva's dance of destruction as the prelude to creation, they're offering a blueprint. Collapse isn't the end. It's an invitation to rebuild differently. Today, as our own world trembles, glaciers calving into rising seas, forests burning with unnatural ferocity, we're faced with a choice older than writing itself. Will we double down on the myths of endless growth, drilling deeper into fragile earth like the Atlanteans mining their cursed orichalcum? Or will we listen to the quieter stories, the ones that teach balance? The Icelanders who harnessed Surtur's fire to heat their homes, the Balinese who still honor Agung's temper by farming in its shadow, these cultures didn't conquer nature. They conversed with it. The most profound lesson these myths offer isn't about predicting disaster. It's about recognizing our role in the cycle. When Pele reclaims a village, she doesn't do it out of cruelty. She's correcting an imbalance, reminding those who forgot that the land is alive. Our climate crisis isn't punishment, it's feedback. The data on rising CO2 levels and shrinking ice caps aren't just numbers. They're the modern equivalent of oracle bones, cracks in the system begging to be read. So here we stand between the old stories and the unwritten future. The myths have done their part, passed down through generations, etched into temple walls and whispered over campfires. Now it's our turn. Will we be the civilization that heeded the warnings, or the one future generations speak of in hushed tones, another cautionary tale of pride before the fall? The answer won't be found in ancient scrolls or algorithms alone, but in the choices we make next. The ground is speaking. Are we ready to listen?